Vault Hunters, welcome to the channel. My name is Josh, and today we're going to be going over the long-awaited update for Borderlands 4, which should include all of the Vault Hunter changes. Now, without further ado, let's just start reading. Welcome to our first significant balance patch. Our high-level goal for Borderlands 4 is to always provide players with the tools and means to build the perfect Vault Hunter. Through the combination of gear, firmware, skill, and specialization trees, we want players to experiment and craft theories, then put them to the test in combat. For today's update, we wanted to focus on creating greater build diversity by adjusting underperforming skills. Amon in particular gets a host of adjustments to bring him closer in line with the general power level of other Vault Hunters. Vex's summons and Rafa's melee power see adjustments to make those builds more viable in late endgame. Finally, Harlowe has a couple tweaks to make sure stasis is getting value for players. Looking to the future, we're investigating stats and behaviors on class mods, rep kits, shields, and firmware to make sure that they are providing avenues to greater build diversity. We're also planning to fix a number of unintended interactions. These exploits prevent us from creating meaningful build diversity as they trivialize content that is otherwise meant to challenge players. Here, we're going to move straight into character balance and adjustments. For Harlowe, we only have one update, I guess, which reads action skills 0 point, stasis slam damage increased by 30%, while stasis immune damage increased by 14.7%. I have not played Harlowe or seen anything for Harlowe yet, so let me guys know if this is a W or if it's irrelevant. Moving straight into Rafa though, action skills Apophis Lance, increased damage by 10%. Okay. Buffs. Capstones, People Person. Project Raiju damage now scales by 12% per second, up from 10%. Project Basilisk damage increased by 15%. Also, Project Basilisk Hazard damage increased by 25%. Project Gorgon damage increased by 17%. Passives, People Person. El Catrin critical damage increased to 8% from 7% per point. Bonus Shock damage also increased to 8% from 7% per point. Per my last, double damage chance increased to 6% from 5% per point. Action skills Arc Knives. Melee attack damage increased by 12%, while dash damage is also increased by 5%. Passives, this year's gimmick. Handshake Deal. Melee damage increased to 9% from 7%. To the last, skill damage increased from 8% from 6% per point. El Pedagogus. Splash damage increased to 9% from 7% per point. Liquidation. Damage increased by 50%. Collaborative Ignition. Bonus and damage increased to 8% from 6% per point. Synergia. Duration increased to 14 seconds from 12 seconds. Melee damage increased to 4% from 3% per point. Empuge. Action skill duration increased to 7% from 6% per point. Those are the buffs for Rafa. Moving straight along into Vex. Action skills Incarnate. Phase explosion damage increased by 16.6%. as well as Eldritch Blast damage being increased by 9.5%. Augments. Vexillation. Energy Vampire damage increased by 25%. Capstones. Vexillation. Heart Piercer damage increased by 22%. Desecration Hazard damage increased by 50%. Desecration Airborne Burst damage increased by 48%, and Geist Wave damage increased by 41%. Passives for Vexillation. Radiant Attunement now deals 7% splash damage, up from 6% per point. Dreadlight Hazard damage increased by 100%. Ars Arcana now increases skill damage by 9% from 8% per point. Action skills for Phase Familiar. Trouble Health increased by 10%, and Trouble damage increased by 29%. Augments. Here Comes Trouble. Violent Outburst damage increased by 12.5%, while Vorpal Fang damage is also increased by 34%. Capstones. Here Comes Trouble. Trouble Bubble damage increased by 33%. Passives for Here Comes Trouble. Blood is Magic now increases action skill damage by 8% from 7% per point. Claw and Bang now increases melee damage by 8% from 6% per point. Passives. The Fourth Seal. Fell Inscription's melee damage increases to 7% from 6% per point. Recurrence now increases melee damage by 0.2% per stack from 0.16% per point. Haruspeck's Phase Dagger damage now increased by 11.7%. That's someone who plays Vex. These are crazy W's. Moving straight on to Amon. Everyone on Twitter is very excited for these Amon changes, so hopefully they get what they asked for. Action skills Scourge. Scourge has had its maximum vengeance increased by 50%. Action skills Scourge. Scourge has had its maximum vengeance increased by 50%, making it able to absorb more damage and deal more damage with Forge Whip when consumed. Forge Whip damage has increased by 27%. Augments. Vengeance. Blast shield damage increased by 45%, Molten Rebuke damage increased by 86%. Eternal Warrior Massive Forge Wave damage increased by 100%. Stormlance damage increased by 52%, and Stormlance detonation damage increased by 10%. Capstones for Vengeance. Glacial Rapture capstone now has a 60-second cooldown, down from 70 seconds. Glacial Rapture Forge Whip damage increased by 16%. Glacial Rapture Fissure damage increased by 41%. Wrathfall damage increased by 46%. Passives for Vengeance. Scorched Kairos now increases ordnance damage by 6%, up from 5% per point. Battleborn now increases gun damage by 4%, up from 3% per point. Scar Tissue now increases maximum health and rep kit healing by 9%, up from 8% per point. Eternal now increases action skill duration by 5%, up from 4% per point. World Breaker damage increased by 50%. Winter's Kiss now increases damage dealt by 10%, up from 8% per point. Strike the Anvil now deals 15% of damage dealt, up from 12% per point. Action skills: Crucible. Forge Axe damage increased by 12%. Double-edged twinned forged axe damage increased by 10%. Augments Cybernetics. Axe and Stone action skill cooldown restoration increased from 40% from 33%. Axe and Stone's action skill ordnance restoration increased from 40% from 33%. Endless Wargun damage taken increases 20% from 50% per prime stack. Hour of the Hammer. Forged Hammer damage increased by 14%. Blade Tempest Forged Sword damage increased by 13%. And Blade Tempest Forged Sword's detonation damage increased by 4%. Capstone Cybernetics. Snowball damage increased by 38%, Storm Surge impact damage increased by 10%, Storm Surge Forge Storm damage increased by 60%, and Conflangering's Capstone's Fire Trail damage increased by 100%. Passives for Cybernetic. Gathering Storm now increases elemental damage by 3% per stack, up from 2%. Executioner now increases critical hit damage by 4%, up from 3% per point. Destruction Engine now increases forge skill damage by 6%, up from 5%. Destruction Engine now increases detonation damage by 8%, up from 6%. Tempered Pyre Forge Axe damage increased by 19%. Temporal Ice Forge Hammer damage increased by 18%. Masterwork now increases Forge Drones damage by 10%, up from 7% per point. Masterwork now increases Forge Drones duration by 8%, up from 5% per point. Tempered Lightning Forge Sword damage increased by 13%. Lightning Rod Elemental Bolt now deals 40% of the damage dealt, up from 30% per point. Escalation now increases Forge Drone's attack speed and movement speed by 5%, up from 3% per point. Honed Point now increases Forge Drone's critical hit chance by 5%, up from 4% per point. Heat Exchange now increases Cryo and Incendiary damage by 8%, up from 7% per point. Action skills: Onslaughter. Onslaughter shield regeneration increased to 15% per point, up from 10%. Onslaughter Rocket Punch damage increased by 78%. Molten Slam has a 60-second cooldown from 80 seconds. Molten Slam damage increased by 50%. Augments Calamity. Fellfrost damage increased by 71%. Fulminating Fist damage increased by 69%. Nice. Capstone's Calamity. Cleave now has a 55-second cooldown from 65 seconds. Cleave damage increased by 11%, and Cleave detonation damage increased by 18%. Molten Royal now has a 70-second cooldown from 80 seconds. Stormcutter now has a 65-second cooldown from 75 seconds, and Stormcutter damage has increased by 65%. Passives for Calamity. Heavy Plate now increases maximum shield capacity by 7%, up from 6% per point. Wield the Storm now increases status effect damage and status effect duration by 7%, up from 6% per point. Tritanium Knuckles now increases melee damage by 8%, up from 7% per point. Tritanium Knuckles now increases skill damage by 4%, up from 3% per point. Harbinger now increases melee damage by 2% per stack, up from 1% per point. Mortal Flare damage increased by 22%. And Judgment now increases melee damage by 10%, up from 8% per point. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these seem like massive buffs for Amon and all the other Vault Hunters except for Harlowe. I don't know why Harlowe only got one buff, but yeah, let me know what you guys think of these in the comments down below. I think these are huge W's. I have only played Vex, so I'll give you the Vex breakdown right now. Big buffs. I can't wait to play with Trouble. I love that little guy. If you guys play Harlowe, Rafa, or Amon, leave a comment down below. Tell me what you guys think of these changes. That being said, I will be live later tonight at twitch.tv/timejush testing out all these Vex changes. But if you guys did like the video, please leave a like, subscribe, and share the video with your friends. It does help a ton. I'm your boy Josh, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.